Fear is often described as personal, subjective, instinctive. That assumption is wrong. Fear in cinema is not something that happens by accident. It is not the result of imagination, atmosphere, or shocking ideas alone. It is the outcome of deliberate technical decisions, choices made long before an audience ever enters the theater. Camera placement determines what information is withheld. Sound design controls what the viewer is allowed to anticipate. Editing rhythm dictates when the brain can rest and when it cannot. Framing silence and restraint shape how uncertainty is sustained. Horror works not because it shows something frightening, but because it engineers perception. In this video, we are not treating horror films as stories. We are treating them as systems. Each film examined here relies on one dominant mechanism, a specific technical choice that governs how fear is constructed and maintained. These films do not rely on excessive exposition, emotional manipulation, or narrative shock. They function through control of space of time, of attention. The goal is not to decide which film is scarier. The goal is to understand why these films work structurally, mechanically, and consistently. Once that structure becomes visible, fear stops feeling mysterious. It becomes measurable. These films operate not because of what they show, but because of how they are built. Fact 1. The Dark Secret of Harvest Home, 1978. The primary fear mechanism in The Dark Secret of Harvest Home is assimilation achieved through narrative patience and spatial routine. The film structures its progression around repeated domestic and communal interactions. Camera framing emphasizes familiarity over threat. Spaces are revisited without alteration, establishing visual consistency. Sound design favors continuity. Conversations unfold calmly. Environmental ambience remains stable across scenes, discouraging anticipation of disruption. Editing prioritizes duration. Rituals and routines are shown in full without compression or emphasis. The viewer becomes accustomed to repetition rather than escalation. This design conditions acceptance. By delaying deviation, the film allows behavioral norms to solidify before they are questioned. Fear arises from recognition of control only after assimilation has occurred. The mechanism is effective because it removes urgency. Without pressure, resistance becomes unnecessary and therefore absent. The trade-off is intensity. The film sacrifices immediacy to maintain structural inevitability. Fact 2. The Possession of Joel Delaney, 1972. The dominant fear mechanism in The Possession of Joel Delaney is behavioral shift presented without explanatory framing. The film minimizes exposition surrounding its central transformation. Changes in demeanor, speech, and physicality are introduced gradually, without editorial emphasis or diagnostic language. Camera placement supports this neutrality. Observational framing avoids signaling significance. Actions are presented without reaction shots that would instruct interpretation. Sound design reinforces restraint. Dialogue remains unaccented by music or tonal cues. Silence is used not to escalate, but to maintain ambiguity around cause and effect. Editing allows behavioral changes to persist without immediate consequence. Scenes do not correct or contextualize deviation. The viewer is required to recognize alteration independently. This mechanism generates fear through recognition delay. Perception adjusts before comprehension, creating unease without confrontation. The effectiveness lies in normalization. By presenting transformation as continuity rather than disruption, the film destabilizes interpretive thresholds. The trade-off is immediacy. The film avoids dramatic revelation to sustain gradual perceptual shift. Fact 3. The Norless Tapes, 1973. The primary fear mechanism in the Norless Tapes is fragmented documentation that denies narrative authority. The film adopts a dossier-like structure composed of audio recordings, interviews, and partial reconstructions. No single perspective is granted dominance. Information arrives in pieces, often without verification or closure. Camera work is functional and restrained, prioritizing record over dramatization. Framing rarely emphasizes emotional reaction. Instead, it supports the impression of evidence being reviewed rather than events being experienced. Sound design is central to this mechanism. Recorded voices lack polish and consistency. Audio quality varies, introducing uncertainty, not as a stylistic flourish, but as a limitation of the medium itself. Silence appears not for tension, but due to missing information. Editing refuses synthesis. Scenes do not resolve contradictions or reconcile gaps. The viewer is forced to assemble meaning without confirmation. Fear emerges from structural incompleteness. The absence of authoritative narration prevents interpretive stability, placing the viewer in the position of an investigator without access to the full record. The trade-off is coherence. The film sacrifices narrative fluency to preserve procedural uncertainty. Fact 4. Born Innocent, 1974. The dominant fear mechanism in Born Innocent is procedural realism, sustained through observational distance. The film adopts a restrained report-like visual style. Camera movement is minimal. Scenes are staged with functional framing rather than expressive composition. This denies dramatic emphasis. Sound design avoids stylization. Dialogue is delivered plainly. Ambient noise remains consistent, grounding scenes in everyday texture rather than heightened drama. Editing favors continuity and duration. Actions unfold fully without compression or escalation. The viewer is required to witness process rather than outcome. This design reframes fear as exposure. Horror emerges not from anticipation, but from sustained observation of institutional function. The mechanism is effective because it resists emotional instruction. Without cues signaling when to react, the viewer must process events cognitively rather than emotionally. The trade-off is engagement. The film sacrifices dramatic rhythm to maintain procedural clarity and restraint. Fact 5. The Possessed, 1977. The Possessed relies on interpretive authority imposed through controlled dialogue and framing. The camera frequently privileges institutional figures through composition. Priests and officials are framed centrally and steadily, while afflicted characters are placed in fragmented or unstable positions within the frame. This spatial hierarchy assigns credibility visually. Sound design supports authority. Dialogue from institutional figures is clear, uninterrupted, and foregrounded. Voices expressing doubt or distress are often overlapped or softened by ambient noise. Editing reinforces this imbalance. Explanations are allowed to conclude fully, while contradictory responses are truncated. The film does not argue its perspective, it structures it. Fear emerges from the elimination of alternative interpretation. When authority defines meaning, uncertainty becomes suppressed rather than explored. The effectiveness of this mechanism lies in visual credibility. The audience is conditioned to accept explanations through repetition of compositional dominance. The trade-off is ambiguity. The film limits interpretive openness to maintain structural control over perception. Fact 6. The Wicker Man, 1973. The primary fear mechanism in The Wicker Man is collective framing that eliminates individual perspective. The film consistently positions the camera within group environments rather than isolating characters. Conversations are staged with multiple figures occupying the frame, minimizing subjective alignment with any single viewpoint. This removes the audience's ability to identify a stable point of moral or perceptual reference. Sound design reinforces consensus. Dialogue overlaps naturally. Songs and chants emerge communally, and silence is rarely individualized. The viewer is never allowed auditory privacy. Editing avoids fragmentation. Scenes unfold with continuity, creating the impression of coherence and order. There are no visual disruptions signaling danger or deviation. This mechanism shifts fear away from threat and toward inevitability. The audience senses control not through force, but through agreement. Because everyone within the frame appears aligned, opposition becomes structurally impossible. The effectiveness lies in normalization. The film presents ritual and belief as operational systems rather than anomalies. The trade-off is immediacy. The film sacrifices sudden tension in favor of sustained structural pressure created by unanimous perspective. Fact 7. Let's Scare Jessica to Death, 1971. The primary fear mechanism in Let's Scare Jessica to Death is systematic doubt produced through restrained confirmation. The film withholds definitive visual or auditory evidence of threat. Camera framing frequently places potential sources of danger at the edges of the frame or outside it entirely. When anomalies occur, they are brief and unresolved. Sound design avoids escalation. Music is minimal and non-directive. Environmental sounds are presented without emphasis, preventing the viewer from distinguishing significance. Editing supports uncertainty by maintaining continuity without clarification. Scenes progress logically, but questions introduced are not resolved within the same sequence. This structure conditions the viewer to distrust interpretation. Fear emerges from accumulation of ambiguity rather than confrontation. The effectiveness lies in repetition. Each unresolved moment compounds doubt, reducing confidence in perception. The trade-off is immediacy. The film sacrifices overt tension to sustain long-term uncertainty. Fact 8. Images 1972. Images relies on perceptual instability created through editorial discontinuity. The film disrupts continuity editing by allowing scenes to overlap without clear transitions. Cuts occur without temporal markers, preventing the viewer from establishing a stable sequence of events. Visual repetition is used without confirmation of recurrence. Sound design compounds this instability. Voices and auditory cues recur across scenes without spatial anchoring, blurring the boundary between memory and present action. Camera placement remains observational, but inconsistent in perspective. Shot-reverse shot logic is frequently avoided, denying relational certainty between characters. This design forces the viewer to continuously reassess perceptual assumptions. Fear arises not from threat, but from the inability to verify reality through standard cinematic cues. The mechanism is effective because it destabilizes trust. The viewer cannot rely on editing to confirm causality or chronology. The limitation is accessibility. The film prioritizes perceptual disruption over narrative orientation, reducing interpretive stability. Fact 9. Messiah of Evil, 1973. The dominant fear mechanism in Messiah of Evil is environmental vacancy reinforced by passive framing. The film constructs fear by removing signs of social activity rather than introducing threat. Street storefronts and interiors are framed with static or minimally mobile cameras, emphasizing absence. Human figures appear intermittently, but without narrative integration. Sound design avoids conventional suspense cues. Ambient noise is sparse and often disconnected from visible sources. This disconnect weakens spatial certainty, making locations feel unanchored rather than dangerous. Editing rhythm favors long takes and delayed transitions. Scenes often conclude without resolution, preventing narrative consolidation. The viewer is left inside spaces that feel operational, but uninhabited. This mechanism alters expectation. Instead of anticipating attack, the viewer anticipates emptiness. Fear is generated through the suggestion that social systems have collapsed without visible cause. The effectiveness lies in subtraction. By withholding activity and explanation, the film creates an environment that feels abandoned but functional. The trade-off is narrative clarity. The film sacrifices causal coherence to maintain spatial unease. Fact 10. The Brood, 1979. The central fear mechanism in The Brood is externalization of internal states through controlled reveal. The film restricts early visual access to its central threat. Information is segmented. The camera avoids full disclosure using partial framing and delayed exposition. This prevents the viewer from forming a complete mental model. Editing rhythm supports this restraint. Scenes end before resolution, shifting focus away from explanation and toward implication. Emotional cues are minimized. Sound design operates selectively. Silence precedes key moments, but without dramatic emphasis. The lack of overt signaling forces attention toward physical detail rather than narrative meaning. This mechanism conditions the viewer to associate uncertainty with bodily presence. Fear is not attached to a visible antagonist, but to the idea that emotional states can manifest without warning. The effectiveness lies in deferral. By delaying coherence, the film maintains control over perception. The trade-off is ambiguity. The film sacrifices explanatory clarity to preserve structural unease. Fact 11. Season of the Witch. 1972. Season of the Witch relies on environmental emptiness and temporal drift as its dominant fear mechanism. Scenes are structured around prolonged domestic spaces with minimal visual variation. The camera remains observational, often static, allowing time to stretch without narrative pressure. Editing avoids compression, preserving duration rather than rhythm. Sound design is restrained. Silence and low-level ambiance dominate, removing cues that typically signal threat or release. This absence denies emotional punctuation. The result is temporal disorientation. Without clear escalation or resolution, scenes blend into one another. Time feels unstructured, reducing the viewer's ability to anticipate progression. Fear emerges from accumulation rather than incident. The film does not present danger as external intrusion, but as erosion caused by prolonged exposure to unchanging space. This technique alters attention. The viewer becomes hyper-aware of stillness, absence, and repetition. Discomfort arises from endurance, not surprise. The limitation is immediacy. The film trades conventional tension for sustained psychological pressure, requiring patience to achieve its effect. Fact 12. Who can kill a child? 1976. The primary fear mechanism in Who Can Kill a Child is moral paralysis, created through delayed visual confirmation. The film withholds explicit threat information for an extended duration. Children are framed in wide shots, often at a distance, performing ordinary actions. The camera does not isolate them as antagonists. This delays the viewer's ability to categorize danger. Sound design reinforces ambiguity. There is no immediate musical signaling to guide interpretation. Ambient sounds dominate, allowing scenes to play without emotional instruction. When violence occurs, it is not staged as spectacle. The camera frequently remains static or removed, preventing cathartic framing. This forces the viewer into the same decision-making delay experienced by the characters. The mechanism functions by blocking instinctive response. Fear is generated not by attack, but by hesitation. The viewer's cognitive system struggles to reconcile threat with appearance, creating sustained tension without escalation. The effectiveness lies in constraint. The film limits access to confirmation, forcing moral processing to occur before fear can resolve. The trade-off is pacing. The film sacrifices momentum to maintain ethical dissonance, prioritizing perceptual conflict over narrative efficiency. Fact 13. The Devils, 1971. The dominant fear mechanism in The Devils is spatial excess combined with performative escalation. The film overwhelms the frame. Sets are large, open, and densely populated, yet visually restrictive due to architectural repetition and blocking. Movement is constant. The camera rarely isolates a single focal point. Performance operates at heightened intensity, but not for emotional effect. Instead, escalation is sustained across scenes, preventing contrast. Without modulation, intensity becomes structural rather than dramatic. Editing avoids relief. Scenes extend beyond conventional pacing, denying closure. The viewer is forced to remain inside prolonged sequences of noise, motion, and ritualized behavior. This creates perceptual saturation. Information exceeds processing capacity. Rather than guiding interpretation, the film floods it. Fear arises from the inability to organize visual and auditory input into coherent hierarchy. The result is disorientation without ambiguity. Nothing is hidden. Everything is exposed simultaneously, removing the comfort of selective focus. The trade-off is accessibility. The film sacrifices clarity and viewer comfort to maintain control over sensory dominance. Fear is produced not through mystery, but through enforced immersion. Fact 14. Alucarda, 1977. Alucarda relies on sensory overload through performance and spatial confinement as its dominant fear mechanism. The film compresses physical space through tight interiors and crowded compositions. Characters are frequently framed in close proximity, reducing visual breathing room. This spatial pressure is amplified by exaggerated performance and sustained vocal intensity. Rather than using suspense or narrative withholding, the film overwhelms the viewer's perceptual capacity. Sound layers stack without hierarchy. Dialogue, chanting, and ambient noise compete rather than resolve. Silence is deliberately avoided. This design destabilizes attention. The viewer is denied a fixed point of control, creating cognitive fatigue rather than anticipation. Fear is produced not through threat, but through sustained overstimulation. Lighting and staging reinforce this effect. High contrast imagery limits depth perception, flattening space and removing visual clarity. Movement within the frame feels erratic, reducing predictability. The effectiveness of this mechanism lies in endurance. The film does not build toward release. It maintains intensity without modulation, forcing the viewer to remain inside a closed sensory loop. The limitation is precision. Subtlety is sacrificed in favor of pressure. The film achieves fear by exhaustion, not by manipulation of suspense. Fact 15. The Witchfinder General, 1968. The primary fear mechanism in The Witchfinder General is procedural violence through neutral framing. The film provides minimal dramatic emphasis. Executions, interrogations, and punishments are presented with restrained camera movement and unembellished staging. There is no visual escalation designed to heighten shock. Instead, the camera maintains distance, observing events with near-documentary neutrality. This framing removes emotional cues that would normally guide audience response. By refusing to signal when violence is exceptional, the film forces viewers to process brutality as routine behavior rather than spectacle. The absence of stylized reaction shots prevents moral release. Sound design reinforces this restraint. There is limited use of musical emphasis during moments of violence. Environmental sounds dominate, grounding the actions in realism rather than heightened drama. The effect is not shock, but normalization. This approach alters perception. Violence is no longer perceived as a narrative peak, but as a function of authority. Fear emerges from repetition and inevitability, not surprise. The viewer is conditioned to expect cruelty without escalation. The trade-off is emotional detachment. The film sacrifices empathy-driven engagement in favor of structural discomfort. By doing so, it transforms horror into a system that operates regardless of individual intent. Horror films are often discussed in terms of story symbolism or shock value. But as this breakdown shows, fear operates long before any narrative meaning is assigned. It is shaped through framing, pacing, sound, and restriction, through what the film allows you to see, and more importantly, what it refuses to provide. If one of these technical choices stood out to you, consider why it worked. And if a film came to mind while watching this analysis, ask yourself which mechanism it relies on most heavily. Fear is not accidental, it is constructed. Which technical decision surprised you the most? And which horror film do you think deserves closer mechanical analysis?